morning from Australia. How are you today? Welcome to our brain-friendly channel. I am Silvia Damiano, and this channel is dedicated to explore issues that affect our brains and our leadership and how we can improve our lives in general and our workplaces in particular for people who have to lead companies and organizations and teams, and why not leading our family as well. So we believe that better brains create better leaders. And today I am so privileged to introduce you to our guest speaker, Dr. Mark Rego from Connecticut in the US. So how are you, Mark?
I am very good. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time. And Dr. Mark has practiced and taught psychiatry for more than 30 years. That's a long time, Mark. You must have seen it all.
Saying a lot.
Yes, I can imagine. So he now studies philosophy and also psychiatry to understand the modern issues that are affecting our minds. So mental illness is a topic that everybody's interested in today more than ever before, particularly after the pandemic and everything that we have gone through. And today we are going to talk about his new book, which is called Frontal Fatigue. So I'm so interested in having this chat today because I think that many people will relate to what you're going to explain. And Dr. Mark is also a father, he's married to a lady that I believe supports you significantly.
Oh, yeah.
And yes, what's her name?
Shira.
Shara. Okay, so in honor of Shara, this session goes. So Dr. Rego has worked with a group of people in the Peruvian Andes in Peru, and he built his first mental health clinic there. So that's also an interesting experience that I want you to talk about. And I believe that you also have your own experience with chronic illness. So, Mark, welcome. And first question is, tell us a little bit about yourself beyond what I have said.
Sure. Well, I'm a psychiatrist. I think I always wanted to be a psychiatrist on some level, but I didn't quite know that until I got on the psychiatric ward in medical school. Then I knew there's something about the mind and the body, and it was just knew there was more to the mind, and it was functioning in ways that we could understand and we could predict and come to talk about. Um, I do live here in Connecticut, as you said, with my wife. I no longer practice, though. I practiced in the community for 23 years, but I taught 1 day a week at our hospital. I have a chronic arthritis condition that runs in my family, and it became harder and harder to go to work, and I was canceling patients and having operations, and it just became too difficult. Many days the choice was, do the patients get canceled or do I go to work sick? And that choice was getting so hard to make. So I had to stop working eventually. And then after more operations and some problems, I developed cancer, very advanced, very rare cancer that has no treatment.
Mm.
But I had a very well trained surgeon who operated twice in my chest. Now, this is almost 3 years ago. And they thought it would be back in months, and I proved them wrong.
Oh,
It's not,
wow.
well, it's nothing I did. That's silly. It's nothing I
Yeah.
did. I had
Okay.
amazing doctors. And so I'm home now, and I have sort of different life, a life where I'm able to read and think and write, which is also something I actually have wanted to do for a long time. But when you're busy going to the office and seeing patients and having a family, and you can't have that kind of life. They used to call it the contemplative life. Um, So I actually have that now, which I'm happy about.
Hmm.
Um, so I get a chance to study more and to write. I have a blog on Psychology Today, and I've had a few articles in their magazine and do some other things. So it's a different kind of life than I had planned, but how many of us can't say that we have a different life than we planned?
Yes.
Um,
How can I ask you? First of all, I'm very sorry to hear about your condition, but it's also great to know that you are much better. How did you adjust your mind to transition? Because sometimes I feel that people get stuck on the plan of life that they dreamt of, and then life takes you, no matter what you do, to different routes. So how did you adjust your mind to say that you're happy now with this life, which is different to what you expected?
it was a fight. I did not adjust to it initially. I was resentful and angry. Um, my friends disappeared because they all had busy lives, and uh, I was not happy where I was. And but I got so tired of that, so tired of being in my own way, so tired of being negative and down and angry. I just didn't want to live that way anymore. Um, and I began to take a little more of an inner person, interior look. Um, I've been interested in Buddhism actually since I was 13,
Hmm.
when I found the Buddhist section in the public library, and it fascinated me. And a lot of Buddhism is about acceptance of life on its own terms. There's a lot of other stuff about Buddhism, but that was a part I had to finally take seriously because now life was dictating the terms for what I did, not me.
Mm.
Um, and it, took a little time, and I actually got a good therapist too, and led to a level of acceptance, but also a level of peace uh, that I didn't have before, I have to say, even though I may have been, in a sense, happier, maybe more cheerful, but not as settled as I am now.
Mm.
So it took a bit of a transformation.
Mm.
I'm not bragging. I was fighting it tooth and nail. I was not gonna change my plans, um, but I did because
Okay.
life did.
That's great, and it's not a matter of fighting the emotions we feel, but navigating through them through therapy or introspection. What would you say to people who have to choose or who can't choose about the life they want to have? What would be your recommendation after going through that?
There's one word that I always present to people, or I used to present to patients, and that's coping. Life is about coping. Maybe another word we can say adapting. And
Yes.
that's a two fisted affair. One fist is adapting, learning, improving, maybe even fighting uh, to improve yourself, to grow, to improve what's around you. And the other fist is to sit quietly and accept things on their own terms.
Mm.
And it seems like it's opposites. Um, and they're not things you just switch on like a light. They're things that are cultivated.
Mm.
They're skills. They're not intellectual. They're not beliefs. And that's your approach. And sometimes you'll need more one fist than the other, and you know that. But if you
Yes.
don't have them both, you're gonna be stuck sooner or later.
Yes. Yes, so true. That's so helpful. And so learning and growing always, and also the practice of acceptance. And, the combination of both is what get us through. Um, I am thinking about all the people that have to go through difficult circumstances in the pandemic and have to stay at home when they didn't want to. How do you think that our mental health in general has worsened because of this lack of understanding of how to navigate situations we don't like?
Well, there's a lot of data on this, and our mental health has worsened. There's been the book is really about how our mental health has suffered. I think since World War II, it's been pretty much going down. Other people would say it's since the Enlightenment, but I would say since at least World War II, the data is strong since 1990 that depression is worse, anxiety is worse, other diseases, OCD, eating disorders, the whole gamut are worse in the sense that they are more frequent and more common.
Mhm.
And some people may say, well, that's because people are going to the doctor. And, the people who do these studies are very careful to try to weed out controls like that and get a good sense of what's going on. And I actually contacted one of the best people in the field. And, some of the points of the book I wanted to be sure about, I called somebody up. I didn't want to assume I knew. And she said, everybody agrees on this now. It's not a controversy.
Mm.
But just to be clear, other illnesses, severe illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, are not more common, but they are more severe. They happen earlier in life. Um, so, to get back to your question, what I think happened during the pandemic, I mean, obviously there were stressors, people being sick, being cut off from our friends, our family members sometimes. But one aspect of it that I think has been overlooked is the same thing that's been happening for decades, which is that we have become more detached from one another and we have become more entrenched into technology and a technological way of life, happened on steroids during the pandemic. So now you're even more cut off from people. You have to work from home. So now you're a student. You have to go to school from home. So now you're more involved with your computer and your technology. Your relationships are like this. They're virtual. They're not real. They're virtual relationships. Um, so what I call frontal fatigue, for reasons that become obvious in the book about the prefrontal cortex, that I think just happened much, much more. And it doesn't cause mental illness, but it causes you to be vulnerable to mental illness.
Yes.
So it's a one large effect that we all have for modern life that leaves us all more vulnerable to mental illness. And interestingly, in the data about the pandemic, the people affected more were young people in every category: suicides, depression, every category, just lack of well being. And if you look at it, who was really the most modernized by the pandemic? It's young people. Even though they were modern already, their lives became totally modern life. Wake up, go to the computer, stay there all day by yourself. At least adults, we had contact, we had to be in touch with different people. We may have a spouse, we have colleagues, we have to pay bills. And we had, attachments to the outside world that we couldn't cut.
Yeah. Yeah.
But young people didn't. And even though they had maybe fewer regular, I'll call them regular stressors like bills and things like that, um, they had more of the kind of stress I write about in the book, which is this, which is being locked here all day.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you, how did you get the idea to write this book? And I imagine that the data is probably one of the drivers of the and your experience noticing things in people. What did you want to achieve with this book? What do you want to achieve?
Um, well, in all of the things I write, I want to help people to understand their minds more. I want to sort of put that on the table of life, that our minds are like other organs. They have different parts that do different things. They function well or they don't. You and I were talking before the show that the old fashioned model of mental illness is either you're crazy or you're fine. But that's not the case. There's lots of gradations of different systems. The mood system is different from the attention system, which is different from the anxiety system, etc. So I wanted to raise awareness. But I also wanted to bring this term and this idea into the modern vocabulary, that there is something about modern life, and it's not just something we can call stress, because our grandparents, mine and yours, of our children's great grandparents, had lives that made ours look like Disneyland. Not enough food, mothers dying in childbirth, children dying, wars going on. Life was very different. But we have a different kind of stress. So we do have stressful lives, and it's a kind of stress that I describe in the book that I just talked about with the adolescents during COVID. Um, so I wanted to bring this really full circle and not just say, well, we're stressed or well, we're lonely. I wanted to I wanted to say exactly what's wrong, and I hope I did that. What's different about modern life? Um, and so there's a lot in the book about that. And how does it affect us? Where's the harm? What's getting harmed? And I think what I hope to show, with a lot of data and with a lot of good support, it's not speculation, that this part, our prefrontal cortex, which is really what makes us human, is getting damaged. It's, we can get all into that. But really, that's what I wanted to do with the book, to place this whole idea squarely into modern conversation, that this is real and it's happening.
So we need to take care of our prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that sits behind our forehead. And I was reading an article the other day talking about the different digital experiences that people are exposed to, and gaming being one of them versus other digital experiences. And the data, the research was saying that it actually develops more gray matter in the prefrontal cortex. Do you agree with this? Do you have any other view on this?
I don't know that study in particular, but there's a lot of data to show. Excuse me. We discussed before the show. I was going to tell your listeners. Sorry again.
That's
That I
okay.
have a vocal cord paralysis from my cancer. There's a nerve that goes from your throat into your chest, and sometimes they have to cut it to get in. It's weird that it's there. Nobody knows why. It just hangs all the way down.
Wow.
Interestingly, if you're a giraffe, yours goes 10 feet down and 10 feet back up to your neck. I just found that out the other day. So it shows it doesn't do anything, but it gets in the way of chest surgery. So after a while, my voice gets tired, and I have to take a little sip of this flavored water here.
Not a problem.
And I'm all better. So Tell me what I was saying again.
We were talking about this digital experience of
Ah,
gaming.
ah, yes,
Yeah.
yes. So there's been an argument, it's a controversy, about whether or not young people are getting better at prefrontal cortex tasks like focus and, let's just say, reaction time. That's kind of a crude task. And I think the data has swung towards the idea that, in fact, they are. That doing things like gaming develops focus and reactivity and scanning. Like you take someone our age or our parents, when you show them a screen and they can't find anything. But you take a teenager, you show them a screen, and bam, they find it. So that kind of attention. So they are actually developing some of those skills, not really in a higher way, higher thinking, but just some basic attention skills. And a lot of people in economics and social science, they think that attention is the commodity of the 21st century. It's not muscle and it's not even skill because things change so fast. It's attention.
Mhm.
So I think they are developing something.
Okay, but on one hand, we may have this benefit of practicing gaming up to a certain number of hours per day, because if you sit in the computer all
Oh,
day,
yeah,
that's going to affect many other things like
absolutely.
yeah. So or destroy some healthy habits like going and exercising or eating the right food and cooking and connecting with other human
Playing,
beings. Yeah, or
having,
playing.
having
Yes, yeah.
unsupervised play. This is a generation of children who has never had unsupervised play.
Yes.
It's just how where you have to make it up as you go along.
Yeah.
Um, so
And
yeah, I'm not saying it's a great idea to stay on the computer.
yeah, no, no, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you. On the other hand, I'm thinking these adolescents or younger people, younger generations have never had anything different to compare against. Like you and I, we come from a different generation. We knew how living without a computer looked like. So, what happens when your whole experience? What happens to the mind from your perspective when your whole experience is sitting at the computer? What are the consequences in general for the mind, not so much for the socialization or whatever, but just for the mind? What happens when you don't have anything else, any other world to compare your mind against?
Now, do you mean like for a child growing up that way?
Yeah. Yes, for a child growing up that way, if my only experience of life is that it's normal to get up and sit in front of the computer to do whatever needs to be done, and you don't know that you have to step outside and be in contact with nature because that's not something that your parents
Yeah.
foster, how is your experience of life from a mind perspective?
Your experience is vacant. Um, if you take children, and this has been done unfortunately in cases of severe neglect where children are left alone all day. Take a children and put them in front of the TV to watch Sesame Street and watch language videos all day. They will not learn how to speak.
Wow.
If you sit them in a room with adults, none of them talk to them at all. But just sit them in a room with full adults, they'll speak. There is something about real life that our brains have spent thousands and thousands of years adapting to. The reality of a life that our senses perceive, that's in 3 dimensions, and people with other minds than our own, who are really there and have needs and demands. It's just not the way we have evolved. I mean, there's so much to talk about. This is such a big area. It's hard to summarize. But that child would be severely stunted.
So
It's
that's
just
why, for example, buying a puppy or getting a puppy for a child is so important to learn empathy, for example. So they say.
yes,
So it is,
people have
yeah,
to start thinking about the mind and needs of another being. What
yes.
does he think? Because he's not going to say. So, what is he thinking, the puppy? What is he feeling? What does he want? Yes, that's a good point. They have to start doing that.
Yeah, so the mind makes sense, or it's much stronger, we could say, when we are interacting with the environment, with other people, with pets, with nature, and that is a healthier way of living for the development of the mind, right?
For the development of the mind and for sustaining mental health.
Hmm.
All
Okay.
of the things you said.
Um,
Other people, yes.
okay, so that's a big takeaway in itself, isn't it? Like we can't live a healthy life from a mental perspective, from a mind perspective, do just one thing, which is, scrolling on the phone or looking at the computer. Um,
No.
what is your experience treating patients in terms of, getting them out of that mode, if you can share how difficult it is?
Well, my practice was a little different. My practice was focused on medication, and I treated people in the office, but also people in nursing homes and people in group homes, a lot of people without autism. Um, so by the time people got to me, they were already somewhat ill, depressed, anxious, psychotic, or other problems that patients with dementia have or patients with autism have. But the interesting thing I found that was once the suffering went away, you didn't have to dig into their lives with them and talk about their past or why they're not adapting. They sort of snapped into life. You didn't have to tell them to go outside or talk to someone. So it's a commentary, if anything, about my practice. It's a commentary on mental illness. Mental illness is suffering. It's suffering with our mental faculties instead of our physical faculties, but they're obviously related. And when that suffering is over, we are ourselves again. Actually, I have an article, I think it's in this month's Psychology Today or last month's, about what I call the two most important questions that never get asked in mental health offices. The first one is, do you feel like yourself? Everybody knows the answer. You don't have to coach people about that or drag it out of them. They tell you right away, yes or no. And then you ask, if it's no, well, in what way? And they'll say, well, I'm not energetic enough. I'm not this or that. And even if they don't feel well, they may say, well, I'm sad because my mother passed, but yeah, I'm myself. They know it. So once people get well and they're themselves again, all of their faculties, their strengths come back. Um, so in my practice, it was not much of a problem to sort of get people back into life. Now, if that was the case, I had other people, therapists, to help me with that part of the situation. So then we would, do some talking therapy. I'd have our therapist do some talking therapy to get people, sort of back into life, depending on what their problem was. But often it wasn't necessary.
Mm. What a great question. Do you feel like yourself? That's an absolutely great question. And as a coach of people who work in a particular organization, most people at times don't feel like themselves. They're either pushed by their manager to do things they don't want to do, or they have this thing about called the imposter syndrome, and they feel they are faking their abilities to be able to perform. So I guess that most people cannot be as authentic as they would like to be. Therefore, they wouldn't feel like themselves. So what you do? What do you suggest that the average person can do in order to go back to center and you know feel more congruent?
Well, you asked big questions, Sylvia. It's a big question.
I
Um,
want to know.
well, I'll say first, I think there's a difference between authenticity and being yourself.
Okay,
I
great.
think being yourself is just sort of basically healthy. Everything is working okay. The
Okay.
car is tuned up. And you can feel it. You feel like everything is working okay. I think authenticity is something that takes work as an adult. It's a deep sense of personal honesty that you are doing what you think is right. You're being the person you feel is right. It has a moral dimension to it, but also a psychological dimension. So that's a sort of a developmental task of adulthood. We would call it is reaching authenticity. Um, that would be a deep sense of, I would say, agreement with yourself, of honesty with yourself about who you are and what you're doing. And there may be forces outside you that are pushing you to do things in a way that you don't want to. And a lot of doctors complain about that today. They're being asked to see too many people and do too many tests. A lot of my colleagues talk about this and they don't like it. They don't think it's right, but they don't feel inauthentic because they're still taking care of the patient. But if it came to the point that they weren't taking care of the patient, they would feel inauthentic. Uh, so, I mean, I would say if there's one word about authenticity, it's honesty. It's
Hmm.
being honest with yourself,
Hmm.
not rationalizing, well, what I'm doing is good for the economy or is putting food on the table for my family. I mean, I know people have to do that, and I don't want to preach about the difficulties of life. But, if somebody asked me that question, as you just did, that's the answer I would give. It's honesty.
Mm. But if the environment puts a lot of pressure on people, and that's why employee well-being or mental well-being has become so important, that would affect as well your honesty, if you are satisfied with the conditions or not. There, and obviously your authenticity, or how authentic you're living your life. And that's why people talk about different values. I don't feel I match these company values, and I'm leaving. So I think it's all in a circle in a way. But this is from what I hear people saying. So stress can cause people not feeling that like themselves, and that would probably affect their willingness to compromise or to participate in an ecosystem. Um, so how do you cope with that? Because values incongruence, your values clash, it's a thing that comes all the time for my clients, which I know it's a different audience that we engage with. But what would you say when people are feeling like that? What could you tell them?
Well, let me think a moment. Um, I think the only reason I'm a little reticent is, it's easy for me to say about where I work or when I work. So I don't want to tell people get up and change your jobs when they need to feed their families and save for college. Um, But I do think, as you're saying, if you want to be at ease with yourself, if you want some sense of peace of mind in this life, honesty with yourself is going to be the way there. If there are a lot of pressures that you can't get around, and I'm not in the corporate world, I was never in the corporate world, but certainly people would talk to me about this all the time.
Yeah.
Um, that they had difficult supervisors, that there were just all sorts of conflicts at work which trapped them and made them do things they didn't like or they didn't think were ethically correct. Not monstrous things, but just doing things the wrong way. I can tell you now that I think about those situations, probably everyone ended in the person leaving, either because they were setting them up to have a reason to let them go because they were cutting back, or they had to leave.
Yeah.
So they pretty much all ended up getting out.
Mm.
Um, there are some employers here. I can think of some in Connecticut who very big employers who I would see patients from, and they always had these problems. But there was a union in these situations, so you had some negotiating power if you were not management. Um, I'd go back to my what I said about coping, that the two-fisted approach of trying to get ahead, working at it, fighting for your interests, but also having a part of you that understands acceptance and the need for acceptance of things that you can't control in life. We often get very angry at people because we think they're trying to hurt us when they're just being their own regular old dysfunctional selves.
Yeah.
They're not trying to hurt us, and we don't need to be angry.
Yeah.
Um, so, I'd probably say do some therapy if you can. So you have learning about ways to cope with the situation. Maybe it's not tenable for you psychologically. Um, talk to other people, talk to senior people, talk to friends. Um, these are all ways of coping.
Yes.
That is still on the fighting side.
Yes.
Um,
Thank you. It's very helpful because once again, by interacting with others, we of our own thoughts, and we can compare if the things that are causing us misery are maybe something that we need to learn to accept and let go. But it is that connection that I guess,
yeah,
whether it's
it's in
therapy
the
or so.
whole a process. It might take some therapy, some introspection, some talking to friends.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Dr. Mark, tell us a little bit more about the book and what are the key elements or the gems that people will take away with them when they read your book.
Can I just answer this one question? Do you
Yes.
mind?
No, not at all.
Andrew asks, do I feel that technology and the increase in adrenaline required to focus is affecting our state? That's very interesting, Andrew. Um, it definitely is affecting, as somebody else who answers might say that it is. It makes us uh, more alienated from being authentic. But I think what Andrew was talking about is the way we have to stimulate ourselves to be focused for so long at our tasks when we're, facing a computer all day and having to maintain a level of attention that we never did before in the history of humanity. Um, so people use the world's most common drug, caffeine. And caffeine boosts your adrenaline in an indirect way because it's a stimulant. And now there are these energy drinks which have super doses of caffeine in them. And I mean, some people can tolerate them. I don't think they're good for you. I don't think they're good for your mental health. Um, Causing that kind of taxing your system will eventually lead to anxiety, even if some people can't tolerate caffeine at all or even in small amounts because it makes them jittery. Other people, like my wife, can have a cup of coffee and go to sleep at 10 o'clock. I can't do that. It would make me too jittery. And that's just the way your own brain works. Um, but people are using more and more amounts of caffeine, and young people are using these monster drinks and other types of drinks to stay alert. And I think it's a bad pattern. We're pushing ourselves beyond our limits and using an artificial way to do it. And I'm not, I don't have a moral thing about that, but it's just not healthy. You're going to end up having problems with heart rhythm and anxiety, sleeplessness. It's bad for depression. So, like a lot of drugs, some people tolerate the drug so it looks like you can use it with impunity. But I can tell you from consulting to the emergency room at our local hospital for 12 years, a lot of people don't. They come in with panic attacks, and you ask them how much caffeine they're using. Well, only 12 cups a day, what I've always used. And so we'll cut that down to four, and your panic attacks vanish.
That's very helpful, and I think that there is a bit of a formula to follow. Sleeping 8 hours, limiting the amount of caffeine, eating healthily, going for walks, because the prefrontal cortex has a limited capacity of approximately 2 hours, and after that you need to take breaks. And some people keep going, 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 and of course they're going to feel anxious at night, or they have insomnia, or they can't, relax. That's extremely common. So, Dr. Rego, tell us a little
So
bit
you
about
want
your.
to talk about the book? Um, well, the book is a story of an idea, and so there are different steps in the story, and it's I've tried to summarize it in article form, and it's a little hard. Um, the book starts with the premise: there is more mental illness and more what we would call lack of well-being in industrialized societies across the globe, at least since 1990, probably since 1960 is where the data gets, but some informal data like books written by psychiatrists in the 1950s suggest that it started after World War II, at least, maybe even earlier. So as a culture, we are becoming more mentally ill, less happy, and more anxious. And I asked the question, well, what's the common denominator here? The common denominator is modern life. That's the only thing that all these cultures have in common. As each decade goes along, we become more and more modern. Well, okay, well, what's modern life? What does that mean? Um, and I have to flesh this out a bit. I'm really summarizing here. What I conclude is that modern life is a technological state of mind. We treat life as if it were a device, whereas in all cultures before our current one, we would have skills and memories and emotions and people around us to guide us through everything from how do you boil an egg? How do you get a job? How do you find a partner? How do you raise children? How do you fix a leaky faucet? How do you not get fat? How do you be the person you want to be? How do you have peace of mind? Every question in how we live our lives, from mundane questions to very broad questions of life. We usually develop them within our cultures, and we had our own ways of doing it, our own ways of cooking, our own ways of dating, our own ways of raising children, of having a spiritual life. And that was somewhat limiting, and modern life offers more opportunities and more liberties, especially for people who don't fit in to cultures. That's important. Um, but what's happened with the breakup of culture in that sense, we don't live in neighborhoods or ethnic cultures or religious cultures or even people who all work at the same factory. We don't live those lives anymore. We live individualistic lives. And what that does is it puts the burden of learning all those things on our own. And instead of being sort of hands on or like the child who is sitting in the room listening to the adults that we talked about, we're looking on Google for the answers for everything. Problems become complex and abstract. You could probably describe how to boil an egg in a very complicated way, but your grandmother could show you in 1 minute. Um, so life becomes a series of complexities and abstractions, and they exist in our prefrontal cortex, which is wonderful with those things. That's why we have these miraculous computers that we're talking on here. So we can build wonderful technology and train great doctors who made me better and do all those things. But it's come at a cost. And the cost is that we are using our prefrontal cortex, which lets us concentrate, lets us form these ideas and what we call representations, just pictures in your mind of what's happening. Change from them on a dime to something else. That's actually a big mental process. Very complicated things like getting the gist of a conversation, um, or knowing what somebody else is thinking, just having an idea about it. Interestingly, people with autism can't do those last two things because their prefrontal cortex is impaired. So we're using our, I'll say PFC for short, we're using our PFC for everything,
Yes.
every part of our day, our personal lives, our professional lives, our leisure lives. We're using our PFCs. And the PFC has two, it's very powerful, and I describe in the book, it has two faults. One fault is it's not meant to work under stress. Under stress, it starts to
I think we have got frozen, and maybe Dr. Mark, if you can log out and log back in. Are you there? Okay, so very interesting, when Dr. Mark refers to the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, and how under stress gets impaired. So one of the things that we focus on at About My Brain Institute is really learning how to handle our daily stresses. And Dr. Mark's point about how modern life has changed us in a way to believe that we can be doing work non-stop without taking breaks or sitting down. Sedentarism is such a big factor in how it affects our minds by not moving our bodies and ignoring this connection that exists between body and mind and brain, are things that we need to take into account. the sleep issue, in order for our prefrontal cortex to rest
I think
at night. Thank you. Yes, great. That was kind of babbling on
so.
a couple of things about the prefrontal cortex, but please continue.
There you go. It's technology for us. So we had to, by the way, we had to do some mental shifting to stop what we were doing, come up with a new plan, have a mental representation of what just happened, all in the prefrontal cortex. Just happened. So what was the last thing live?
How stress affects or impairs the prefrontal cortex functioning.
So yeah, so we find ourselves unable to concentrate. We start forgetting words. Our temper flares. Somebody interrupts us. What do you want? We get angry easily. Then we know the PFC is starting to struggle. And when we have a complete emotional breakthrough and start yelling or crying, it's broken down. The other important thing about the prefrontal cortex that we know from imaging study, brain imaging, and also from injuries, brain injuries, strokes, and injuries that soldiers get or car accidents, is that if you damage or impair the PFC, you will produce a mental illness of some sort. You may just produce some, in the case of an injury, you may just produce some disinhibited behavior, but stress, if you stress the prefrontal cortex enough, and there's any vulnerability in your brain, whether it's anxiety or depression, which are probably universal, or any other illnesses, you can bring them out. And scientists have now done this, and I spoke to the person who's the world's authority on this particular process. That was the step I needed for the book, to actually say, do scientists really know that if we stress the PFC enough that we can go on to mental illness? And the answer is yes, they do. So we've gone from the increase in mental illness to the stressors of modern life, which are all mental, cognitive, complexity, abstraction of life, having to focus constantly, relearning things. Every time you learn something, it changes. I call that reformatting. The PFC handles these things wonderfully, but not all day, every day, and under stress. It doesn't. We do that, we create a vulnerability that we all carry. That vulnerability, and that is frontal fatigue. It is the chronically fatigued frontal cortex that we all now carry. And it's not going away. So we have to learn ways for ourselves, because society isn't going to change. We have to learn ways to look at that specifically. A lot of people look at stress in general, and they do yoga and meditation, which are wonderful. I do both. But we have to know the PFC a little bit better to find its weak points and when it's struggling and what to do about it.
So really taking note of your of your struggles in a way, and your thoughts and how you're feeling in a moment in time, and doing something about it. I guess it becomes more relevant than ever.
Absolutely.
And one thing, why is it that that people in general resist so much the topic of meditation? Like, people understand that meditation could be helpful for their minds, but then they don't have the discipline to do it. Is it because they're too tired, too stressed? What do you think?
I think it's just one more thing in busy lives. And, good things go from our like to do list onto our have to do list pretty quickly. Um, so it becomes just one more thing, and they'd rather veg and watch TV, which is, I talk about that in the book when I talk about ways to manage frontal fatigue. That vegging is a way to slow down. It's okay. You come home, you're tired, your mind is running and running, and you watch the TV, and for a while, even one longer, 2 hours, and you're just calmer and you've unwound. But that's not, I mean, that's some PFC care, but it's not a way to start being a little more in control of your PFC. So how do we do that? That's the big question.
Please, please, how do we do it?
Well, it just so happens I know a couple of ways. So there are two prongs to this fork. One is getting out of the PFC. And there are three basic ways: your hands, your senses, and other people. Your hands are do crafts, do cooking, do working around the house, play an instrument. As soon as you work with your hands, you'll feel that stress go away, or at least you'll feel that you're using different mental muscles. Our mind knows how to work with it. It knows all these tasks. We don't have to train it. These are deep within us. So lead your life through your hands for a little while instead of all the time through your head. So the
Thanks.
second is our senses. And by this, I don't mean our sensuality. I'm not a prude, but that's not what I mean. I mean our five senses. We are deprived of sense input, of common beauty. Indulge your senses. Go to the museum, go to the park. If something attracts your senses, and again, I know what everybody is thinking, that's not what I mean. If it attracts your senses, if it intrigues you, it pulls you, it makes you curious because of the way it looks, it sounds, it smells, it tastes, pursue it. Go there. Make that a part of your life. Think about what's missing in your life in that way. For example, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I took up landscape painting,
Mm.
which if you saw me draw, you would never think in a million years I would do. But I did. And, I could go off and do something else from work, maybe play chess or watch the news, but it doesn't get me away. I pick up the paintbrush and the muscles shift. It's a totally different thing.
Yeah.
My mind and body know how to do it. I don't have to tell it, but I'm in a different place. And people say that about sports, about lots of things. So your hands, your senses, and other people. We're very stiff about other people in modern life. We don't want to upset them. We don't want to be intrusive. But we're made to be with other people. We're not made to be alone. So whether it's playing a board game or joining a book club or just chatting with the neighbor who's mowing his lawn or who's walking down the block, um, be with other people and talk to them. Ask them what I recommend is ask them questions. People love to talk about themselves.
Yes.
So be interested in other people. Ask them about their families and what they do. And it's okay to talk to other people. And it's part of our humanity. We need it. So those three things, lead life with your hands, with your senses, and through other people, are ways to think about getting out of your PFC. Your brain knows how to do all of these things. You don't have to learn any of them. They happen naturally.
That's very
The other-
helpful and a beautiful way to put it. Hands, senses,
Thank you.
and people. So
See. I guess. The other
That,
way, oh,
yeah.
there's two spikes on this fork. The other way is going in your mind, not getting out, because we're going to be stuck in here for a long time. We have to be somewhat masters of our minds. The way I think we talked about this before the show, the way in the middle of the 20th century, suddenly people decided they had to exercise and diet for the first time ever in human history. They had to control their bodies because life didn't do it for them. So, the first thing I recommend, and probably the biggest thing, is to find a way to quiet your mind. You don't have to become a Zen master. And I don't even mean meditation. I do some breathing exercises, I do the painting. Um, but quieting your mind is really, your mind is noisy. You can hear your mind, you can see it, and you can feel it. It's different than outside feeling the thing, but you can do all these things. And when your mind is quiet, you know it. When I pick up the paintbrush, as horrible as my paintings are, when I pick up that paintbrush, my mind gets quiet. My father used to say the same thing about tennis, that it made him stop thinking. So we need to find ways that our minds get quiet. And I mean literally quiet. Now, also, if you want to move on to meditation and become some more focused, I do breathing exercises like in between works, in between things, to settle me down, focus me, center me. Um, the second thing in somewhat, mastering our PFCs, which I talk about in the book, is deep reading. Deep reading, I think, is Western meditation. Deep reading is not a page turner. So find something that's a little bit challenging, but that you like still. You don't have to read Dostoevsky. Find something that you like, fiction, nonfiction. It's a little bit challenging, and read it slowly. Don't rush it. You don't have to. It's not homework. You're not going to be tested. Don't try to read the whole sentence. Just read little blocks and take it in. We don't do that. We read like this now. We read a text message.
Yeah.
So deep reading, there's a lot of interesting research on this, how it deepens concentration, a sense of relaxation, insight into whatever you're reading about. So those two things. The third thing is a little different. Excuse me. And it's the beginning of some personal introspection that I think we all eventually need. And I call it changing ed to ables, which when I made the book in Spanish didn't work because it doesn't go that way in Spanish. Ed to ables means, let's say something upsets you, makes you very irritated. You can say, hey, he irritated me. That guy, he's irritated the heck out of me. Or you could say, I'm irritable. Now, you're not blaming yourself, but you're probably saying true. No matter what the situation, part of it is your own susceptibility.
Yeah.
But also, you're putting the locus of control in yourself,
Yeah.
not out with other people and things. So when I say, no, Silvia didn't irritate me, I'm irritable, I'm not just owning it and all that kind of stuff, but I'm putting the control back here.
Yeah.
And also, I'm seeing what is probably true. So that's just one step in a life project of introspection. But it's a sort of basic step that I think is a good starting point, and it has a, catchy title, Changing Ed to Ables. So the second part, which is more going into your brain, is learning in some way for yourself to make make yourself quiet the mind, read deeply, slowly what you're interested in, and change Eds to Abels. Not irritate, head, irritable,
Mm.
not sad end. Words get a little funny. Sadable. That's not a word. But people know what that means. So again, I like two-fisted approaches. We want to get outside of our PFC, and there are those ways that come totally naturally to us. They are part of our humanity. They're part of our heritage as human beings that we are missing. Our senses, our hands. Our hands are magical. I tell you, there are people who specialize only in hands in medicine. There are so many nerves and muscles and things they can do, and other people, which we are meant to be with. And then the other is we have to turn inward somewhat and have some control inside. I was looking here, Tracy. Do you mind if I read this?
No,
I don't want to
absolutely.
take over your. I don't want to take over your job. Is that for me to read?
Yes, you can read it. You're giving a break to my prefrontal cortex, so all good.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. Incorporating these things into breaks while working also helps shift from cognitive brain to creative brain, refreshes and re-energizes us so we can come back to the task at hand. I agree 100%, Tracy. She's talking about just the general process of just taking a break. I get up at least every hour. I walk around the house. I play with a dog. I open the door if it's not too cold. Get outside for a moment. I just have to do that constantly to refresh myself. And she raises the question of creativity, which is a whole massive other issue of an untapped thing that we ignore also in our humanity. Um, but for a lot of people is central to their lives, is who they are. Maite talks about the difficulty in learning and training to meditate. Very true. Very true. It just, it's a hard skill. It's not an easy skill. So I would probably recommend breathing exercises instead of meditation if you want to learn a way to center yourself and to be able to relax. So maybe you talk for a minute while I rest my voice.
Absolutely. Dr. Mark, we could be talking forever with you. I mean, there's so much wisdom within you and in your book. I've been reading it and I still have a quarter to finish. And I found it fascinating. So I'm pretty sure that anyone who is listening to us today will want to run away and buy your book. Where can they get it?
They can get it online anywhere. Amazon,
Anyway.
Barnes and Noble, any of the online stores. It's in paperback and ebook.
Okay, great. And it's coming soon in other languages?
Well, like we talked about, I had a Spanish version, but I discovered, in talking to Maite, who's online today, that the translation was very, very poor. So I pulled it off of Amazon and I actually just wrote a review from myself offering to give people their money back who bought it and found it was terrible.
Okay.
Um,
Well, I
so
hope someone helps you to get it right and it's available
uh,
in Spanish.
we hope to do that.
Yeah, many people need to read your book, and I highly recommend it. It has been such a pleasure meeting you and talking with you, Dr. Mark, and the things that you have shared for people to do are so simple, and it's very clear to me now that mental health, issues and problems are on the rise, have been on the rise, and are on the rise. So we are all responsible for managing our minds. If we don't manage our minds, nobody else will do that for us.
Right.
We can't rely on services or governments because it's just overwhelming. So people like you who contribute to this field in this simple, full of wisdom way are so appreciated. We need more of you, Mark.
Thank you. That's all very kind of you to say that. I really enjoyed talking today. We had a very good, very fun conversation.
Yes, it's been fun. So thank you once again. We are going to wrap up now, but I hope to talk with you again soon and have you for another session of our Brain Friendly channel. So thank you so much, and thank you to our audience and for your comments and for being there. It's fantastic to have people attending these sessions because we all need to learn to live better lives and create better leadership, but also better humans in this world that we have.
That's right.
So
Be better people.
yes, thank you, Mark, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye
everybody. Bye bye.